The old house on Hemlock Lane had stood silent for a decade, a monument to a tragedy the town of Millburn desperately wished to forget. Its paint, once a cheerful white, was now a leprous gray, peeling away to reveal the rotten wood beneath. The garden, untamed for years, had become a snarled fortress of thorns and weeds. To most, it was simply the Fletcher place, a name spoken in hushed tones, a place to be avoided after dark. But in the autumn of 1973, a young family saw not a haunted monument, but a promise of a fresh start. Mark and Helen Gable, with their 7-year-old daughter Lily, moved in on a crisp September day. The low sale price was a blessing they could not ignore, and the town's vague warnings they dismissed as small-town superstition. The house was solid, they reasoned, and its dark history could be painted over with new memories. The first week was a blur of unpacking boxes and the cheerful chaos of renovation. Lily, a quiet child with wide, observant eyes, claimed the small bedroom at the end of the upstairs hallway. It had a cozy nook she immediately adored. It began not with a bang, but with a whisper, so faint at first that it was mistaken for the rustle of leaves against the window pane or the settling groan of an old house. Lily was the first to hear it. She mentioned it to her mother one evening, her small voice casual. "The wall in my room talks to me," she said. Helen, wiping flour from her hands, smiled indulgently. "That's just the house saying hello, sweetie. It's an old house, it has lots of stories." But the whispers did not stop. They grew slightly more distinct each night, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to emanate from the very plaster of Lily's bedroom wall. It was not the sound of the wind or the pipes, it was a voice or something imitating one, a sibilant, breathy murmur that was just below the threshold of understanding. Lily stopped mentioning it. She began to spend more time downstairs, clinging to her mother's side, her once bright eyes shadowed. Her sleep became fitful, punctuated by nightmares she could not fully describe. Mark, a practical man, checked the walls for rodents and the attic for nests of birds. He found nothing but dust and silence. He assured his wife it was just the child's imagination, fueled by the strange new environment. But Helen felt a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She had started to hear it too when she tucked Lily in at night. A faint, papery sound like a secret being shared over and over again, just on the other side of the wall. The atmosphere in the house began to change. The cheerful new paint and fresh curtains could not dispel a new, profound chill that had taken root. The whispers were an invisible poison seeping into the foundation of their new life, a constant, unsettling presence that was slowly driving a wedge of fear and suspicion between them. The happy home they had dreamed of was becoming a prison. Its walls, not a shelter, but a membrane containing a terrible, unspeakable secret. The investigation into the whispers became an obsession for Helen Gable. While Mark continued to dismiss it as imagination, Helen's maternal instinct told her the threat was real. She spent hours in the Millburn Public Library, her fingers tracing through microfiche records of old local newspapers. The friendly librarian, an elderly woman who remembered the Fletcher case, grew hesitant when Helen pressed for details. "Some stones are better left unturned, dear," she warned, her eyes clouded with old fear. But Helen was relentless. She finally found the story, buried in the archives from November 1963. The headlines were stark and brutal. "Fletcher family slain. Police baffled." Arthur and Eleanor Fletcher and their teenage son Thomas had been found murdered in their home on Hemlock Lane. The crime was one of unspeakable violence. The case grew colder and more bizarre. The only survivor was the Fletcher's 6-year-old daughter, Sarah. Found hiding in a kitchen cupboard, she was catatonic with shock. When she finally spoke, weeks later, her story was fragmented, terrifying. She told police about a bad man who had come in through the back door, a man who talked like a snake. She said he had whispered to her brother before he... Helen stopped reading, a cold dread washing over her. The article noted that Sarah Fletcher was placed in a state psychiatric facility, where she remained to that day. The case was never solved. No motive was established, no suspect was ever arrested. The house, stained by the horrific event, was shunned, its ownership passing through distant, uncaring relatives until it landed in the hands of the bank, and eventually, the Gables. Armed with this horrifying knowledge, Helen's perception of the whispers shifted. They were no longer just a creepy noise. They were a ghost, an echo of a profound evil. That night, as she passed Lily's door, she heard it clearly for the first time. It was not a single voice, but a layered, rhythmic hiss like a corrupted recording. And within the static, she could almost make out a word, repeated over and over. Thomas. She burst into the room and gathered a sleeping Lily into her arms, carrying her to the master bedroom. Mark, startled awake, could no longer deny the terror in his wife's eyes. The following day, he swallowed his pride and called the police. Officer Miller, a seasoned cop with a tired face, listened patiently to their story. He remembered the Fletcher case. He walked through the house, tapped on the walls in Lily's room, and sighed. "It's an old house," he said, his tone final. "It makes noises. You're letting the history get to you." He left them with a pamphlet for a local psychologist. Defeated and more frightened than ever, the Gables were left alone with the whispering wall. The police saw superstition, but Helen knew the truth. The house was not haunted by a ghost in the traditional sense. It was haunted by a moment of violent, unresolved crime, and the whispers were a psychic wound that would not heal, a recording of a killer's voice trapped in the very fabric of the building, forever calling out to his final victim. Driven to desperation, Helen Gable made a decision. If the police wouldn't help, and her husband's rationality was useless, she would find the one person who might understand what was happening. She arranged a visit to the Crestwood State Psychiatric Facility. The building was a grim, sprawling complex of red brick and barred windows, a place where time seemed to have stopped decades ago. After a long wait in a sterile, green-walled visiting room, a nurse wheeled in Sarah Fletcher. Sarah was a woman in her late 20s, but she had the hollow, timeless look of someone who had retreated from the world long ago. Her hands lay limp in her lap, and her eyes were focused on something far away. Helen, her voice trembling, introduced herself and mentioned the house on Hemlock Lane. At the name, a flicker of life passed over Sarah's face. Helen carefully explained about the whispers in her daughter's wall. For a long moment, Sarah was silent. Then she began to rock slowly back and forth. Her voice, when it came, was a dry, unused rasp, but the words were chillingly clear. "He didn't come in through the door," she whispered, her eyes wide with the memory. "He was already in the house. He was in the walls." Helen felt the blood drain from her face. "Who was?" Sarah's rocking intensified. "The whisper man. He talked to Tommy first, a soft, snaky voice, through the heating grate in his room. He told Tommy he was his secret friend." She clutched the arms of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. That night, the whispers got louder. They were angry. Tommy told him to go away. The whisper man didn't like that. She described in the simple, horrifying language of a traumatized child How the man had emerged not from a door, but from a hidden space behind a loose section of the wall in her brother's closet. He was a blur of pale skin and wild eyes, and he moved with a terrifying speed. The last thing Sarah remembered before hiding was the sound, not of screams, but of that same relentless, sibilant whisper, now mixed with the wet, terrible sounds of violence. Helen left Crestwood shaking. Sarah's account was not the story of a random break-in. It was a story of infiltration, of a predator who had stalked the family from within their own home, hidden in a space no one knew existed. The Whisper Man had not been an intruder. He had been a tenant, living in the walls, whispering to a young boy before finally revealing himself in a storm of blood. Back at the house on Hemlock Lane, Helen confronted her husband with this new, horrifying information. This time, Mark did not argue. The specific, terrible detail of the heating grate and the hidden space was too precise to be a coincidence. Together, their fear now forged into a grim resolve. They went upstairs to Lily's room. They moved her small wooden bed away from the wall. Mark, with a crowbar from the garage, approached the closet. The whispers seemed to grow more frantic, a rising hiss of static from the other side. With a deep breath, he jammed the metal tip into the seam of the wall and pulled. The drywall splintered with a sickening crack. A cloud of dust and the smell of ancient, stale air billowed out from the darkness. Mark and Helen stared into the gap he had created. It was not just a wall cavity, it was a space, about 2 feet deep, running the length of the bedroom. It was a hidden passage, a secret corridor built into the very frame of the house, a place for someone to move unseen. Mark shone a flashlight into the void. The beam cut through the dust motes, illuminating the grimy timber frames and decades of accumulated cobwebs. Then the light caught on something else. Tucked into a nook between the studs was a small, crude nest, a flattened cardboard box, a stained, moth-eaten blanket, and an empty can that had once held beans. This was not the lair of an animal. This was a hiding place for a man. And then they saw the writing. Scrawled across the inner wall of the house, over and over in what looked like charcoal or perhaps something darker, was a single name: Thomas. The letters were frantic, jagged, a madman's graffiti. The source of the whispers was now horrifyingly clear. They were not a ghostly echo, but the final, terrifying secret of the Fletcher house. A man had lived here, hidden inside the walls, whispering to a boy through a grate before slaughtering his family. He had imprinted his obsession onto the very structure of the building. The police were called again, this time to a very different scene. The cold case of the Fletcher family murders was abruptly reopened. Forensic teams in 1973, armed with new knowledge, scoured the hidden space. They found more than just the nest. Tucked deep behind a support beam was a small, water-stained notebook. Its pages were filled with the same deranged handwriting, rambling poems about silence and noise, and obsessive descriptions of the Fletcher family's daily life. The author was a man named Peter Croft, a handyman who had done work on the house months before the murders. He had been questioned briefly in 1963, but was dismissed as a harmless eccentric. He had vanished from Milburn a week after the killings and was never seen again. The Gables did not wait for the official conclusion. They packed their bags that very night and never returned to the house on Hemlock Lane. The happy home they had sought was forever tainted by the profound, intimate evil they had uncovered. The horror was not in a ghost, but in the tangible human monster who had used the architecture of the house as a weapon. A man who had whispered his way into a family's life before extinguishing it. The house was demolished the following year. The lot on Hemlock Lane remains empty to this day, a bare patch of earth that the locals still avoid. Some say that on quiet, windless nights, if you stand too close, you can still hear a faint, papery sound. Not a ghost, but the chilling memory of a whisper, a permanent scar on the silence. A reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not those that lurk in the shadows, but those who make their home just on the other side of the wall. For more stories that blur the line between the unsettling and the unknown, remember to subscribe to the Eclipsed Chronicles YouTube channel.